In my line of work, I visit various care homes to conduct reviews with residents. I spend most of my day going in and out of these places, sometimes for just a couple of hours, and other times for an entire day. I've become accustomed to the routine, but there was one unsettling experience I had. One of my cases passed away, and the following week, while visiting another case at the same care home, the staff mentioned something strange. They said the deceased man's buzzer kept going off every night, even after his passing. The buzzer had never malfunctioned before, and the room was still empty. In a different home, there's a basement room I often visit to review files. The moment I step inside, something changes. I feel incredibly tired and sluggish, but once I leave the room, I snap back to normal. The heaviness is not just in my mind, though, it's something other people have noticed as well. I checked with others at the office, and they felt the same sensation. Today, I was at a larger care home than usual. I was sitting in the nurse's station, reviewing files, when two people walked in. A nurse and a man followed closely behind her. I didn't immediately look up from my work, but I could see them in my peripheral vision. The nurse, who I recognized as staff, walked across the room behind me and began reaching for some paperwork. Then she moved to the other side and sat down. As I focused on the papers in front of me, I became aware of the man standing just beside me, where the nurse had originally been. He was a large, burly guy with brown hair, hands resting on his hips, and wearing blue scrubs. I could feel him staring at me. It was a tight, uncomfortable space, and I had the sense that I was wedged between two people. It's a small office, so the lack of personal space made the situation a bit overwhelming. When I finally looked up to ask if he needed something, he was gone. No one had left the room, though. There was no way someone could have walked out without me noticing. He had vanished in the time it took me to shift my gaze. Later, I realized that the blue scrubs he was wearing weren't even part of the care home's uniform. It only occurred to me after the fact, and I couldn't shake the oddness of the situation. This happened on two separate occasions, one on February 5th at 6:30 in the morning, and the second time today at 6:16 a.m. I'll start with the first one. I went to the laundry room to put on a load of washing, and the only lights on were the ones in the laundry room and the light in my room, which illuminated part of the hallway. When I finished my laundry, I heard footsteps, and when I looked around the corner, I saw a dark figure running toward me with heavy footsteps. I immediately assumed it was my brother, so I called his name. But then, the figure abruptly turned right into the living room. Confused, because he usually responds, I turned on the living room light. To my shock, there was no one there. I went to my brother's room and asked if he had left his room, and he said no. That definitely gave me a chill. Then today, around 6:15 a.m., I was still lying in bed when I opened my eyes and saw my younger brother standing next to my closet, holding his tablet. His body was facing the closet, not towards me. It struck me as strange since my door was closed. I closed my eyes again, trying to fall back asleep. But then, I decided to open my eyes again and saw him standing much closer to me, right by my bed, still in the same position. I tried to say something, but I felt like I couldn't speak. I struggled with it for a bit, and then finally managed to say talk multiple times. Suddenly, the figure just vanished. I got up, unable to believe what I had just seen, and went to my younger brother's room. He was fast asleep in his bed. That sent a chill down my spine again. I've thought about it, and I'm wondering if it could have been sleep paralysis, but I'm not sure. I was still able to move, and I was wide awake. I know what sleep paralysis feels like, and this didn't feel like that at all. So I'm unsure about what exactly happened, and I'm not sure what to do about it. If anyone has advice or any thoughts on this, I'd really appreciate it. If you're enjoying the stories so far, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Every summer, my friends and I like to have spontaneous little campfire gatherings in quiet, secluded spots, avoiding the hassle of driving an hour to a proper campsite and paying the fees. One particular spot near my house, by a river, is perfect because it's usually empty. The only real concern is bears, especially since I live in the Pacific Northwest, right next to the mountains and the forest. One evening around 11 p.m., I decided to head out early to the spot and set things up before my friends arrived so we could just chill right away. To get there, I have to take a 2-minute paved walkway and then a small trail down the right side of the bridge that crosses the river. There are 2 lamps along the walkway, one at the start and another halfway, and they're the only light out there. I parked my car at the trailhead and brought everything I need for the fire: flashlights, lighter, some firewood, a small shovel to dig the pit, etc. When I got to the spot, it was this little sandy beach-like embankment by the river, a nice area where families bring toddlers in the summer. I set up my chair and started digging the pit, using my flashlight to light the area. I was shoveling sand away from me, far from the water, but suddenly I heard a huge splash, loud enough to be from something big, like a rock. I thought I might have accidentally thrown some sand into the river, but after checking, there was nothing in the water. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was imagining things. But then it happened again, another loud splash. At this point, I figured maybe something from above was falling into the water. I pointed the flashlight up at the trees, but I didn't see anything big enough to make such a sound. My heart started racing as I kept digging, and then I heard rustling from the area under the bridge. I quickly pointed the flashlight toward the sound and called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. In my head, I was thinking it might be a bear, and I should probably leave right away, but when I checked, there was no sign of any animals or anything out of the ordinary. I convinced myself I must be imagining things. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me, like something out of a horror movie. But then, I heard it again, rustling leaves. This time, it was unmistakable. I quickly shone my flashlight over to where the noise was coming from, and as my eyes focused, I froze. I saw the naked back of a man hunched over. The anxiety hit me hard, and I could barely process what I was seeing. Of all the things I expected, this wasn't it. From what I could tell, he seemed to be in his mid-40s, with a shaved head, not bald, and a medium build, kind of a mix between chubby and muscular. As I kept the flashlight on him, he started to stand up, and that's when I realized he wasn't wearing pants. My heart raced as I started to connect the dots. He must have been the one throwing things into the water to either scare me or chase me off. That was enough for me. I quickly started packing up my stuff, panicking and trying to leave as fast as I could. I grabbed everything and started speed walking out of there, heading up the ramp and onto the paved path. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I kept glancing over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. I was in Crocs, so I was hoping I'd be able to make a quick getaway if it came to that. I made it halfway up the path, and a small sense of relief set in. I thought I was finally in the clear. But when I checked behind me one last time, I couldn't believe my eyes. Slowly creeping over the ramp was the same man, on all fours, moving like some kind of primate. His head was turned toward me as he crawled forward, and once he reached the middle of the path, he stood up. Without hesitation, he started running toward me. At that moment, pure panic hit me, and I took off as fast as I could. I ran like my life depended on it. My flashlight flew out of my pocket, but I didn't even care. A naked man was chasing me in the dark, and all I wanted was to escape. I looked over my shoulder just once, and saw him still running after me, still completely naked. At that point, I couldn't think about anything except getting out of there alive. I finally made it out of the forest, and the car was just 30 feet away from the edge of the woods. But I was still panicked. I rushed to my car, fumbling with my keys like a classic horror movie scene. Of course, I dropped them. In that moment, I honestly thought to myself, I'm going to die here. But I pushed the thought aside, picked up the keys, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw my things into the back seat and jumped into the driver's seat as fast as I could. It felt like it took an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only about 6 seconds. As I fumbled with the ignition, my eyes kept darting to the end of the path where I had just been, watching to see if the naked man was still coming. Finally, I got the key into the ignition, and I sped out of there as fast as I could. About 30 seconds into my drive, I got a call from my friends. They were asking if I had made it to the spot yet. All I could say was, "Guys, do I have a crazy story to tell you?" They ended up coming to my house, which wasn't far from the campfire spot, and I told them everything that had just happened. They swore none of them had been trying to prank me, and I knew none of them would go to those extremes. But as we were talking outside, a college student walking home passed by, heading in the direction of the bridge where I'd seen the naked man. Without thinking, I yelled out, "Hey, man, be careful. There's a naked guy who was chasing me by the bridge." He looked at me, shrugged, and said, "Oh, really? I've got to go over that bridge to get home, Star." I just told him, "Good luck, man." The next day, I called the police to report the incident. They sent an officer to meet me in person so I could show them where everything happened. When we went to the spot where I had seen the man's hunchback, the officer didn't find any signs that anyone had been there recently. However, they made a note of it just in case something like that ever happened again. Some of my friends think it might have been a skinwalker. Others believe it was more likely a homeless person, someone mentally ill, or someone drunk or high. One theory that came up, which I thought was kind of funny, was that it could have been a future version of me playing a prank on my past self. Honestly, if time travel is ever real, I'd totally pull something like that just to mess with younger me. Anyway, that's the story, and it's something that I'll never forget. The feeling of running away in the dark, terrified and looking over my shoulder, will stick with me forever. It's something I still talk about with my friends whenever we hang out. I reside in the Klamath Mountains in eastern Oregon, roughly 20 miles from the California border. Growing up, I spent a lot of time outdoors, camping, hunting, fishing, and so on. Recently, while on a family trip to our cabin near Crater Lake, I had an unusual encounter, and I was hoping to find out if anyone else has experienced something similar. One late afternoon, I was alone, watching birds by a small pond in the woods about half a mile from the cabin. I was sitting on a large log with binoculars. I wasn't in a blind, but I chose a spot where I thought I would be less noticeable to animals. After about an hour, I hadn't seen much aside from a few common ducks, and since the animals seemed inactive, I was considering leaving. This was maybe an hour before sunset. But then, I noticed something move between the trees across the pond, around 100 feet away. It was just a quick flash, and I couldn't get a clear look at it. I kept watching that spot, and after about 5 minutes, I saw something dart from one tree to another. It appeared larger than most local birds, except maybe a heron, and it moved incredibly fast without making a sound. Still, I wasn't sure what I was observing. This happened a few more times, and each time it seemed to be getting closer to the pond. I didn't think it was aware of my presence, but it stayed hidden, revealing itself for only a split second each time. At this point, I thought it might be a kit fox or a pine marten. Given how quickly and silently it moved. But I still hadn't gotten a good look at any part of it. It moved between trees a few more times until it was behind a large dead tree right at the water's edge. I stayed as still and quiet as I could, worried that it might notice or smell me and run off. A few minutes later, I saw something move at the water's edge. A small arm and hand, almost human-like, reached out and touched the mud. Then, the head and the other arm appeared as it leaned down to drink from the pond. From my vantage point, I could only see the head, shoulders, and arms, but they looked remarkably human, except for being smaller and covered in what seemed like grayish-brown fur. Its face wasn't entirely human, more monkey-like, but I couldn't see much detail due to the distance. I decided to lift my binoculars for a closer look, but as soon as I moved, it looked up and disappeared behind the tree again. I stayed there until it started getting dark, but I never saw it again, not even moving between the trees. I returned to the cabin and told my grandpa about what I had witnessed. He's been a rancher in this area his entire life, and when I told him, he said it sounded like I encountered a hide behind, then chuckled. I told him I wasn't joking, but he just shrugged it off. He mentioned he'd heard stories about Bigfoot and hide behinds and even claimed to have seen small human footprints during hunting trips deep in the mountains where no children would be. I think he believed me to some extent, but didn't really know much about it. I asked my dad and brothers about it, but they just started teasing me about squatching. The next day, I went back to the pond and walked around the area where I saw the creature, but I didn't find any tracks, scat, or fur. Based on the trees, I estimated it had to be about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, but it was narrow enough to hide completely behind a pine, which made me think it was likely standing and moving upright. That's pretty much the extent of it. I wish I had seen more of it, but the face and hands were definitely not like anything I've seen on a local animal. It looked more like a monkey or a very small human. I've tried to find more information, but the only cryptid people talk about around here is Bigfoot. The hide behind is usually treated as a joke. There may be references to little people or humanoids in some local Native American folklore, but there isn't much detailed information available. Anyway, I hope someone here might have some insight into what I saw. It was a truly unique and memorable experience, and any additional information would be greatly appreciated. My great-grandfather homesteaded in Alaska before the area became developed and overrun with traffic. It used to be a peaceful, swampy place with harsh, freezing winters. As you'd walk through the swamp, you'd often come across spots that weren't fully frozen, even in the dead of winter. While this is not entirely uncommon, running water doesn't always freeze. It added to the area's eerie atmosphere. The region was also geologically active, which contributed to the environment. My great-grandfather, however, had an interesting backstory. He spent time in Ireland before settling in Alaska and often told a tale about rescuing a pair of fairies while he was there. In exchange for his help, they made a pact with him, granting him the ability to see things that no one else could. He claimed to have brought them with him when he moved to the homestead, providing them with alcohol and good company throughout the cold winters to keep them around. As long as they had alcohol and companionship, the fairies would remain. We would occasionally see strange things at the swamp. This wasn't just something that happened when we were kids, but even as adults. They resembled glowing balls of light, usually white, though sometimes they appeared as red or blue. Not a faint tint, but a bright, glowing red or blue, like a glowing M&M. A few times, we even saw them inside the cabin. Sometimes, the lights would follow us or gather nearby while we were chopping firewood, though not every time. The red light was a constant presence when someone was hurt, and we believed it was a harbinger of bad events. We were all convinced that it brought misfortune. I'm not sure if anyone outside of our family ever witnessed the lights, but every person in my immediate family has had multiple encounters with them, and at least one negative experience with the red light, or as my family calls it, the fairy. The cabin had a lodge-like design, fitting the remote, rustic atmosphere. The rooms were lofted on either side of the living room, much like in some hotels where there's an open central area, and the rooms are separated by banisters. While that layout isn't too important, it does play a part in the story. From the upstairs, you could see both sides of the wall dividing the kitchen and the sunroom. More than once, I would see these small balls of light hit the wall and then pass right through to the other side. There was also the occasional sound of whistling, like an echo of what my great-grandfather used to sound like when he was drinking and, as he would say, conversing with the fairies in his putter room. This phenomenon wasn't confined to just the house, though. It would also happen in the swamp, and at times when you were alone on the property. The homestead burned down not long after my great-grandfather passed away, about 7 years ago, and to this day, no one has rushed to rebuild. I do wonder occasionally if the lights or the whistling still exist out there, but honestly, I'm not eager to find out. Something about it all makes me feel like those lights and sounds aren't actually fairies. This took place when I was 15, and my younger sister, Candace, was 12. A bit of background: we'd been living in this small, safe town for a few years. A few years after settling in, a police officer, along with his wife and children, moved into the house 2 doors down. Our house, built in the 1920s, had a certain charm to it. A few nights before this event, our older siblings had locked us out of the back door. Being careless, we tried kicking the door in, but instead of giving way, the frame came loose, leaving the door hanging. One of the blinds behind the TV got broken, but with 8 kids in the house, there was no money to fix it. Just outside the window, there was a garage and a driveway. Adjacent to the driveway was an overgrown patch of land on the neighbor's abandoned property. What we didn't know was that 2 people were hiding in the thick shrubs, watching us. I'll leave out some details for brevity, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask. My name is Aria, and my younger sister is Candace. This all happened in the summer of 2009. My oldest brother and his girlfriend were about a mile away from our house, fishing around 10 p.m. Everyone else in the house, including our parents and siblings, was asleep. While my brother and his girlfriend were fishing, I was sitting in front of the TV by myself, watching it. Candace was sitting on the bed next to me, also watching TV. Suddenly, both of us heard a loud crash coming from the back door, and we both screamed in shock. We quickly ran to the phone and called our brother's cell. He told us he was on his way because his girlfriend had twisted her ankle. When he got home, we had already woken everyone up, and all the lights in the house were on. My brother, who is 6'4" and about 300 pounds, told us to stay inside. However, unbeknownst to my family, I slipped outside to check with him. I know it was reckless, but I was just a curious kid. I found my brother standing there, unusually quiet. He sprinted towards our fenced-in backyard, getting close enough to reach the guy. However, as he stepped on a stick, the guy turned around, looked back at my brother, and then took off running. He hopped over the fence and managed to escape. Unfortunately, I didn't see any of this because I had gone back into the house after a while. This is what my brother told me afterward. When he came back inside, he explained that he had seen a man dressed in all black, about 6 feet tall, but that's all he could make out. The rest of the night was fairly calm, with my brother staying on high alert. The following night, my brother was out with his girlfriend again, and it was around 10 p.m. Candace and I were sitting in the same spot as before, watching TV. Once more, we heard a loud crash from the back door. We screamed again and called our brother's cell phone, and he came home once more. The entire house woke up, and all the lights were on. My brother went outside to check, but this time he didn't see anyone. Oh, and I forgot to mention. Both times, when we looked at the back door, it appeared to have been kicked really hard. This time, the frame was nearly ripped out of the wall, and the door was leaning further into the house. We didn't file a police report because there was a cop who lived 2 houses down from us. However, when he was at work, us kids would help out his pregnant wife, bring her food, play with his kids, and so on. We didn't see him much, but when we did, he was always really kind and sweet. We told the police officer what had happened, and he believed that there were 2 people involved. He thought they had been stalking our house, keeping an eye on us. The officer came over, inspected the area, and said that one of the guys must have been on lookout, hiding in the shrubs while the other attempted to break in. He explained that they likely had been peering through our broken blinds and that, from the outside at night, you wouldn't be able to see anything if you were looking out. After those 2 nights, there were no more attempted break-ins. Later that fall, our cop neighbor shared something with us. He said, "I'm not really supposed to tell you this, but we actually caught a peeping Tom. He's in jail now, about 20 miles away." He mentioned that after the peeping Tom was caught, he believed that was the reason everything had stopped. He suspected that this man was the one trying to break in. The officer assured us that the town was safe again, but Candace and I were still really freaked out and scared. To this day, we always make sure our windows and doors are locked, and we check them multiple times a day. Whenever our curtains are left open, we get anxious and immediately close them. Honestly, I'm afraid that something like this could happen again one day. We no longer live in that town, but that fear still lingers. We never really figured out what their intentions were, but I truly believe that if they had gotten in, there's a strong chance we wouldn't be here today. And that is a terrifying thought. During my 8th grade and high school years, I was an extremely depressed kid. My mom was an abusive alcoholic, which created a lot of negative energy that not only filled the house we were renting but also seemed to hover around me. I was naive and, honestly, even more so than I am now, and I often gave this negative energy a lot of attention. I had a lot of minor experiences during that time, like hearing voices, lucid nightmares, and scratches on my body, but one experience stands out in my memory. I was spending the night at my grandparents' house. I wish I could remember why I was there, but it's hard to recall many memories from that period because of the trauma. In any case, I had spent a good portion of my life in my grandparents' house. I was staying in my old room when I was suddenly and aggressively shaken awake. I sat there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling, but I quickly brushed it off as just one of those nightmares where you feel like you're falling or something. But as I settled back down and tried to go back to sleep, I heard a snapping sound. It wasn't rhythmic, just very aggressive snapping all around the bed I was lying in. By that point in my life, I had become so desensitized to strange occurrences that I just sighed in frustration and tried to go back to sleep. I don't know how much time passed, but for a second time, I was shaken awake. This time, the bed was shaking a little too. I knew it wasn't one of those falling nightmares. At this point, I remember sitting up in annoyance and just looking around. I had a nightlight in the room because I'm a bit scared of the dark after some past experiences that I might share another time, but I could see everything fairly clearly. The snapping started again, coming from all around my bed. Once again, I muttered some obscenities and angrily tried to go back to sleep. Finally, though, for a third time, I was shaken awake. This time, the shaking continued for a few extra seconds after I woke up. I sat up again, and this time, the snapping noises were louder and seemed even closer to me. They were much more chaotic as well. I was really getting frustrated at this point. As I glared around my room, something suddenly whizzed past the front of my bed and hit the tall metal lamp on the left side of the room. For whatever reason, that pushed me over the edge. I remember saying some pretty choice words to whatever was causing this and threatening it before throwing myself back onto the pillow, turning on my side, and yanking the blanket over my head to sleep. After that, I wasn't woken again. The following morning, I looked around the lamp to see what might have been thrown, but I couldn't find anything. It sounded like metal hitting, so I assumed it was a coin, but I couldn't find anything. I've also had other experiences at my grandparents' house and my own, so let me know if you're interested in hearing more. But to finally address how this could be debunked, I've been diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, and depression, and there's a chance it could all be explained as hallucinations. I fully acknowledge that possibility. I've also had some intense nightmares around this time, during which I could feel things. However, in those nightmares, I was always lucid. I'm not going to deny that it could have been made up in my head and that my mental illness could have caused random things to manifest, but certain aspects just don't seem to line up with that. For example, if it were a hallucination, why and how would I have been shaken by an outside force? If it were a dream, it could make more sense, but there are two things that don't add up in that scenario. I was always tortured physically in my dreams, so why wasn't this dream like all the others? Additionally, I was only ever physically tortured after I realized I was in a dream, not right off the bat. And I felt a lot more, I don't know, connected to the situation than I typically do in dreams. Also, the fact that I was physically shaken for a few seconds after I woke up. I mean, I really felt like someone was shaking me. Maybe it was just my body reacting to something, but it definitely felt like an outside force was involved. I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts and if anyone has had similar experiences or can offer any insight into what might have happened that night. Thanks for giving me the chance to share, and I understand not everyone might believe this, but I appreciate you listening regardless. I usually consider myself a skeptic and don't typically believe in this kind of stuff, but I've been having some strange experiences lately. I don't really have anyone to turn to, so I'm hoping this place might provide some answers, or at least rule out some possibilities. It all started a few months ago. My house is small, with only 3 tiny bedrooms. For most of the time I've lived here, there have been 5 people here. I shared a room with my sister until October of 2023, when my brother moved out and she took his old room. A little while after that, I started noticing odd things. At first, it was just a feeling of paranoia, I guess. When I was in my room, which was the only place this would happen, I'd feel really paranoid for at least an hour before falling asleep. It wasn't just the usual anxiety. It was more like feeling intensely watched or being overly sensitive to sounds. I'd feel this deep sense of unease. Then things escalated. I started feeling something hovering near my ear. I never saw anything, but I could feel it, like that sensation when someone whispers in your ear, but it would feel like it was hovering just above my ear. This only ever happens with my right ear, which is odd. It just so happens that when I lay on my left side, I face a mirror since it's the closest door. I've heard that's considered bad luck, but anyway, the strange experiences continued. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I distinctly heard a man's voice whisper, "Stay awake," in my right ear, which completely freaked me out, for obvious reasons. Along with that, I also felt that same hovering, watch sensation. Lately, I've also noticed things moving in my vision. Shadows in the corners of my eyes and small white blurs crossing my sight. This mostly happens in my bedroom and not anywhere else. There's something even more unsettling that's been happening while I sleep. I usually sleep with my hand under my pillow, and sometimes my hand peeks out from beneath it. That's when things start. Something grabs my hand. It always begins with my index finger, gently pulling it as though trying to be discreet. Then it moves to my pinky before going back to the index finger. At that point, it starts making small circular motions with my finger, lightly pressing it against the pillow, and does the same for each finger until it reaches my pinky again. After that, my headboard starts shaking. I've also noticed that my mattress shakes slightly while I'm asleep, which definitely isn't normal. As far as I can remember, this is all the detail I have for now. I'm really worried that there might be a ghost in my house, and I'm also concerned because mental illness runs in my family, with my grandpa having had schizophrenia. So, I'm reaching out to ask, could it be a ghost, or should I consider being evaluated instead? And if it is a ghost, what can I do about it? I'll try to answer as many responses as I can, so feel free to ask for clarification or leave any comments below. I'll do my best to respond to all of them. It was 2004, and Mars was brightly visible in the sky. I was 14 at the time and had a habit of chatting with the neighbor kid on the left through our windows. We often do things like point a laser at the TV of our neighbors across the street or simply stargaze. This particular night, though, I was alone, perched on my bed, my elbows on the windowsill. I had opened the window fully, creating an opening between the vertical blinds with my body, and I was trying to spot Mars among the constellations. It was nearing summer, and it took me a little while to notice something unusual. Across the street, in my neighbor's yard to the right, something caught my attention. I was very familiar with my surroundings, having spent many nights observing the neighborhood in the dark. This yard was at the corner, bordered by the wall of a 3-story house, casting a lot of shadows and making it pretty dark. Every garden in the neighborhood had fences for privacy, and each was about 300 to 320 square feet in size. But in the middle of this yard, I saw something strange, 3 eyes, arranged in a triangle shape, glowing like a cat's eyes. It took a moment for me to process what I was seeing. When I realized that this wasn't something that should be there, fear immediately washed over me, as it was staring right back at me. My heart raced, and I quickly dropped down onto my bed, trying to calm myself. But I had to know if I had really seen something odd, so I shot back up, pushed the blinds aside, and peeked out the window again. This time, I caught it mid-motion. It had moved and was now partially behind the fence that separated my backyard from my neighbor's. As it moved, it turned to face me and stood still. This all happened in just a few seconds, and now only the top and right eyes were visible, still gleaming in the dark. It freaked me out even more because I realized that whatever this was, it had gotten closer to me, and it was really tall, probably close to the height of the fence, which was about 6 to 6.3 feet. At that point, I panicked and dropped back down onto my bed. A few moments passed, but I was so terrified that I quickly slammed the window shut, fearing whatever it was might crawl through. Then, I heard the eeriest sound coming from the garden. It was a very high-pitched buzzing noise, almost like an unbroken, trembling beep that repeated twice. After that, there was complete silence. For years, I've been left confused about what I really saw, and I checked the garden at different times of the day and night, hoping to find a logical explanation. When I tell people about this story, especially those who are interested in paranormal topics, they always say it's an incredibly detailed encounter and encourage me to share it with others who might have similar experiences. So, I'm sharing it here in hopes of getting some sort of explanation, or at least to hear if anyone else has had a similar experience. I honestly still don't know what to think about what happened. I work for my city's water department, and my daily tasks involve repairing leaks or performing new installations for homes and businesses. Our department has two sections that keep everything running smoothly: distribution, where I work, and production. Production handles the chemical side of things, including chlorinating the water and conducting water sample tests. They are also responsible for maintaining our water well sites and storage facilities, like the tall water towers you might see around the city, and mowing the grass around those sites. Both parts of the department are severely understaffed right now, so we occasionally help out with the mowing. A couple of weeks ago, it was my turn, and this is where things got a bit strange. My city, located in central Louisiana, has a population of about 45,000, and it's surrounded by wooded areas. No matter which direction you travel in or out of town, you're bound to see plenty of trees. Many of our well sites are out in the woods, which is why most of the city's trucks are four-wheel drive with mud tires, something that's often necessary. On that day, I was heading out just before sunrise to a site down a long, dirt road. If anything goes wrong out there, you better have a charged phone because you're in an isolated spot where no one will hear you. Interestingly, this wasn't where my unusual encounter occurred. As the sun was rising, I was approaching my first site when a doe with two fawns stepped onto the road. Eagerly, I grabbed my camera and snapped a few photos. Surprisingly, the doe and her fawns weren't scared of the loud, rumbling diesel engine of my truck. The speckled mother calmly watched me from the vehicle. Once the fawns safely crossed the road, the mother doe glanced back in the direction she had come from and then joined her little ones in the tree line on the opposite side. I quickly finished mowing, loaded the equipment onto the trailer, and texted my mom the pictures of the deer as I headed back into town. She replied, saying, "I've read that deer are an omen of good fortune. Looks like you're going to have a great day. Be safe, and I love you." And I did have a great day. I handled the next two sites without any problems, and everything was going smoothly. That is, until I reached the gate of the last site I had to mow. The McKeithen site is the largest one we have near town, about the size of a football field. It's not exactly in the middle of nowhere, but it's on the outskirts of the city. There's usually plenty of traffic on the road, so it never feels secluded, despite being surrounded by thick woods on three sides. I've mowed this site many times, but that day felt different. I drove through the gate and immediately felt the urge to lock it behind me quickly. I parked the truck near the tower, as I'd done countless times before, but once I turned off the engine, everything felt unusually heavy and eerily silent. I don't know how long I sat there before I could bring myself to open the door and get out. The moment I did, though, I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. The sensation was coming from the back right corner of the field, outside the fence, near the tree line where the palmetto bushes grow. I took a deep breath to calm myself and reminded myself that I was surrounded by an 8-foot, unclimbable fence with a locked gate. Sure, if someone had a gun, they could have shot me, but they wouldn't have been able to get to me. If the barbed wire at the top of the fence didn't stop them, a face full of weed-eater string blades would. With that in mind, I hopped onto the zero-turn mower and started mowing, keeping a close eye on that back corner with each pass. It took me about 2 hours, as the overgrowth was pretty thick. Once I finished the front, it was time to tackle the back near the creepy corner. Just as I was about to head in that direction, the mower blades refused to engage. I spent a good while troubleshooting, removing covers, pulling grass out of the belts, and clearing the deck. I even had to grease the pulleys and do a bunch of other maintenance. After all that, I finally got the blades going, but then the gas light came on. I didn't realize it at first, but it felt like something was trying to prevent me from reaching that part of the lot. Eventually, I got everything running again and quickly finished mowing the back, making sure to keep my eyes on the fence the entire time. Once I'd finished, I loaded the mower onto the trailer. I still had a bit of weed eating left to do, but when the weed eater wouldn't start, I knew it was time to leave. I hadn't had any issues with it all day, but at that point, it was the final sign that I needed to get out of there. After locking the gate behind me, I pulled onto the highway to head home, but before I drove off, I glanced back at the corner one last time. That was when I finally saw it, the unmistakable shadow of a figure standing in the palmettos. It wasn't trying to hide or remain unseen. It was definitely there. At a safe distance, I stopped to watch, and then it moved. It shifted to the side, as if trying to get a better view of me on the road. The figure had no distinct features, no hair, no clothes, just a vague, person-shaped mass. I decided I needed to get as far away as possible. The thought that I had been so close to it for so long without noticing sent a chill through me. It confirmed the uneasy feeling I had the whole time I was there. That night, I called my mom and told her everything that happened. She told me she'd done more reading about deer and learned they are often considered a sign of protection. Some people believe a deer represents a higher power watching over you. While I'm not sure about all that, hearing it made me wonder, what if I hadn't seen the deer that morning? Would I have seen the shadow? Could it have done something to me? Why did it choose to reveal itself to me at that moment? Was it something about me, or was it tied to that part of the woods? My mind raced with questions, but then my mom texted me later that night. She was sitting on the back steps in our small hometown when she heard rustling near the storage shed. She shone her phone light into the darkness, and there, standing in the yard, was a deer. Deer had never come into the backyard before, but that night, a large one stood tall, staring back at my mom. She said it felt like the deer was there to reassure her, as if saying, "It's okay. He's safe. Don't worry, we've got him." I don't know about all that, but I do know this. I saw something strange that day. I'm not sure what it was, or what it was doing there, but it was definitely there, and it gave me the creeps. I'm a 29-year-old man, and this past Friday night, I went out partying with 4 female friends, 2 of whom I had just met that evening. We were having drinks at a club in Central Europe, dancing, and enjoying ourselves. The night was going great. Around 2 a.m., the girls decided to head home and grabbed a taxi together. I chose to stay a little longer to finish my drink. I spent about 20 more minutes dancing on the stage before calling a taxi to head home myself. When I arrived on my street, I realized I didn't have my keys. Living alone, I had no way to get inside. Frustrated, I called another taxi and went back to the club to search for them. My first stop was the bar, where I asked if anyone had turned in lost keys, but no luck. Determined, I began retracing my steps, using the flashlight on my phone to search every corner of the club. After about 10 minutes of combing through the crowd, I returned to the spot where my friends and I had been sitting earlier. This time, I decided to check the benches where we'd left our jackets. My keys were always in the inside pocket of my jacket, which had been placed in the corner of that bench all night. When I sat down to search, I noticed a guy next to me openly doing lines of drugs on his phone and sharing them with others. His jacket was lying in the corner of the bench where my jacket had been. To my surprise, when I lifted his jacket, there were my keys right underneath. Overwhelmed with relief, I started shouting in joy, as I had been getting pretty desperate by that point. Nearby, I recognized someone we had met earlier that night. Let's call him Al. He had been friendly, so I struck up a conversation while still buzzing from finding my keys. I even went to the bar to grab another beer and chat with him. At one point, I went to the bathroom, and when I returned, Al was talking to someone else. I decided to finish my beer, smoke a cigarette, and get ready to head home. That's when the guy with the drugs, who introduced himself as Pedro, a name I suspect was fake, started talking to me. Pedro, who claimed to be 19 and from Colombia, shared stories about his life. He told me how his family was struggling back home after his father's recent death and how he was in Slovakia to earn money for them. He even showed me pictures of his family. I felt sorry for him and sympathized with his situation. As the night went on, El left with a girl he had met, buying some MDMA from Pedro before leaving. This drew attention from others on the bench, who also started asking Pedro for drugs. Pedro made more lines on his phone and handed them out. At that point, I told him I was heading home, wished him luck, and grabbed my jacket. As I started walking away, Pedro stopped me, saying it was late and he should head back to his hotel too. He quickly scraped the drugs off his phone, leaving the rest for others, and joined me. He said his hotel was only a 5-minute walk away and asked if I'd walk him there. Feeling sorry for him, I agreed. Along the way, he kept thanking me for understanding his situation and called me a good person. When we arrived at the hotel, Pedro messaged someone to come open the door. He asked if I wanted to share one last beer with him, and I agreed but made it clear I'd leave afterward. A girl opened the door and greeted Pedro in Spanish. The hotel didn't look like a typical public hotel. It had a reception desk, stairs, and a dining room. Pedro told me to wait in the dining room while he got the beers. Inside, a girl was sitting with her laptop. I greeted her with hola and sat down. Pedro returned a few minutes later with 2 open cans of a drink with a parrot and Jack Daniel's logo. Despite the open cans being suspicious, my drunk self didn't think twice and drank it. As we talked, I began to feel strange, tingling in my hands and eyes, and an overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I quickly turned on my phone's location and mobile data, putting it in a different pocket than usual. Pedro started asking how I felt, which heightened my anxiety. I realized I'd been drugged. I confronted Pedro, asking why he gave me something if his intention was to keep me conscious. His hands shook as he typed on WhatsApp, seemingly relaying everything I said to someone else. I told him I knew what was happening and was leaving. Pedro apologized, saying I was free to go. I walked out, but not before fist bumping the girl at the laptop, who gave me a grimace in return. Once outside, I ran to a main street, called my mom, and stood under a bus stop camera for safety. A white Mercedes SUV parked nearby, its lights off, making me even more paranoid. After a tense wait, the car eventually drove off, and my mom arrived to pick me up. Still shaking and disoriented, I asked her to drive around the city instead of heading straight home, fearing someone might follow us. Later that morning, I went to the ER with spasms all over my body. Tests revealed I had been drugged with fentanyl, ethylphenidate, and ketamine, a terrifying cocktail. The doctor mentioned that incidents like mine had been happening more frequently in recent years. To this day, I don't know why I was drugged, whether it was a kidnapping attempt, organ trafficking, or something else. All I know is that I'm incredibly grateful to have made it out safely. Not long after I moved to England, I found myself adjusting to a new reality. Back in my own country, life had been getting worse year after year. Low wages and a high cost of living left little hope. I'd had enough. My best friend had recently moved to England with her boyfriend and their dog, and they invited me to stay in their spare room. I moved in and split the rent while looking for a job and my own place. But our time in that house was short-lived. Just 2 weeks later, we relocated to another home. While the new house was an upgrade, the neighborhood left a lot to be desired. The real problem, though, was my friends' constant fighting. Every night, they'd argue over who worked harder or contributed more at home. It was exhausting, so I'd often volunteer to walk their dog just to escape the tension. Most of the time, it was uneventful, probably because the streets were quieter during the pandemic. But one night was different. That evening, as I grabbed the leash and stepped outside, I had a strange feeling, like I shouldn't have offered to go. Still, I brushed it off, thinking it was better for me to be out there than my friend. At 25, I was well-built and broad-shouldered, more capable of handling trouble, even though I wasn't particularly tall. I left the building with a trash bag in hand, tossed it, and headed toward the main road. I like to keep the walks varied for the dog, so I paused to decide which direction to take. That's when I noticed a man jogging toward me from the left. Something about him felt off. He wasn't dressed for a run, just regular everyday clothes. Trying not to judge, I turned to the right and began walking the other way, keeping an eye on him just in case. The dog was on edge too. He was a muscular mix of a bulldog and a Portuguese hunting breed known for his intense focus on potential threats. He kept stopping to stare at the jogger, forcing me to tug him along every few steps. The man was about 30 seconds away, and the dog's unease only heightened my own. When the man got closer, I decided to cross the street. If he was harmless, he'd keep running. If not, he'd follow, and that's exactly what he did. When I began crossing the street, I glanced back to see how the man would react. It was as though I had disrupted his plans. He looked surprised, slowed down, and walked past me and the dog, his movements uncertain. As he passed, he raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender and said, "Hey, bro. All good?" I replied, "All good. You?" "Yeah, boss." "Yeah," he answered, continuing ahead. Thinking the situation was over, I returned to the side of the road I had originally been on, assuming it was just a misunderstanding. But then the man stopped. He turned to see I had switched sides again and did something strange. He backtracked a few steps and hid behind a tree, as if trying to conceal himself from someone further down the street. That's when my discomfort grew. My heart raced, adrenaline kicked in, and I had to fight to keep my composure. I tried to appear unbothered, continuing to walk steadily while glancing at him now and then. As I passed him on the opposite side of the street, I gave him a pointed look, silently warning him that I wasn't oblivious. But just as I was starting to calm down, I heard a sound up ahead, a shuffling noise. At first, I thought it might be a fox, but the noise was too loud, too deliberate. It was coming from something, or someone, much larger. Then I saw it. A second person was crouched behind a trash can near one of the houses further along. I could see part of their back peeking out from the side. At that moment, I realized there was no way I was going to risk continuing forward. Whether or not the dog and I could defend ourselves wasn't a gamble I was willing to take. I turned around and calmly began walking back the way I came. As I passed the man hiding behind the tree, I nodded at him and said, "Good night." His startled expression confirmed everything for me. They hadn't expected me to figure out what was happening, let alone retreat without confrontation. Once back near my building, I let the dog do his business in the small grassy area out back and called it a night. It wasn't worth venturing further, not in a neighborhood like this, high crime and only getting worse. My decision to turn around felt even more justified when, a month later, my boss's son and his friend were mugged at knife point by someone wielding a machete just up the road from where this had happened. Looking back, I'm certain I made the right choice that night. Thanks for watching. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chilling tale. See you in the next video.